Firstly, thank you very much for the invite and the opportunity to speak today. I just wanted to first introduce myself. So yeah, I'm Sam Haynes. I'm head of indices at Verisk Maplecroft. Maplecroft, we're based down in Bath. We're about 100 people. A couple of colleagues of mine, Alex Channer and Michelle Carpenter, are actually in the top 100 influencers list. And essentially what Maplecroft does is we make data on risk. We basically help our clients to assess their assets that they own or they work with and their suppliers and help them to prioritize their response to the risks they're facing. To take an example, modern slavery, one of the biggest issues that we're asked about by our clients. If ESG departments or human rights departments, they have limited budgets and resources, they need a way of prioritizing their response to kind of guard their reputations against the risks they face in their suppliers. We cover a whole range of issues, so economic risks, environmental, political and human rights, specifically labour rights. That's kind of the biggest aspect of the data that we sell. The top issues, in fact the second most popular issue that we're asked about is modern slavery. The first is corruption, which is kind of endemic across every sector that we're involved with. So a frequent question that we hear from clients, those clients could be from retail and consumer goods, they could be from food and beverage. We do a lot of work with oil and gas and metals and mining as well. But a frequent question we hear is, where am I most exposed to modern slavery in my supply chain? That's a kind of a good opening kind of question they ask. They always want more detail. We provide country-level data, but things vary by industry, clearly, as we've heard today, even in the UK. So we have information on how things change by industry, and even by commodities. Certain commodities are more at risk of certain labour rights violations, just on how they're farmed or how they're mined. So try and provide information on all these kinds of aspects. The clients are after kind of more detail. One of these aspects is subnational. So how does the picture vary within a country subnationally? That's a very difficult question to answer in most cases, and the UK does give us a way of doing that. So a question we're going to kind of address today, I'm going to talk about now, is which parts of the UK are the most vulnerable to modern slavery? Any company that sources from or operates in the UK kind of should be interested in the answer to that. There's a sort of a second supplementary question, which is why does it vary? This helps from kind of an investigation sort of perspective. So why are there more victims of modern slavery in one part of the country compared to the other? Two slightly different things. Anything that can help us to understand the drivers of modern slavery can help with its detection and ultimately its eradication. So you see the map on the right-hand side is where we have estimated which parts of the UK we estimate to be the most vulnerable to modern slavery in the UK. Each area is based on a police force area, so there's about 42 of them in total. And the colouring is based on the number of victims that we predict per 100,000 people of working age. And I'll explain how we got there. So as I said, data on modern slavery, very difficult to come by, even in developed countries. The UK is something of an exception to this, but this kind of information doesn't really exist on a subnational basis outside of the UK, particularly OECD countries as well. So the National Crime Agency publishes data about victims who choose to go through the National Referral Mechanism. The latest information that we have is from 2016-17, which has about 4,000 victims, and that's provided in the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner's report, broken down by the 42 different police force areas. So the thing to say is this data has limitations, as with any data set. The reporting may vary. There may be some parts of the UK that are better at enforcing or finding victims. There may be a difference in the willingness of individuals in different parts of the UK to go through the NRM. There may be even a difference in the willingness of, the knowledge of victims that they are actually victims, as we've heard previously. All these things vary. And as we've heard, there's about 4,000 or so victims reported in this, or potential victims rather, reported in this data set. We've heard elsewhere that it could be as high as 10, 13, the tens of thousands. So there's a great level of uncertainty about what the actual number is. Just looking at the raw data, the more people there are, the more victims there are, which stands to reason. Over a third of the victims were in the Met police force area, but there's lots of people there. So to kind of account for the fact that there are more victims or there are more people, what we first did was to look at the rate of victims per 100,000 of working age population. That changes things slightly. So Bedfordshire actually comes out as the highest risk on that basis, about 36 victims per 100,000, and the Met is in second with about 30. By doing this, it makes things comparable. We can compare apples with apples. So this doesn't tell us why, though. So, for example, using the raw data, why is the West Midlands at higher risk, apparently, than Greater Manchester? We need to do something a bit more. And what we did was we built something called a linear regression model. Basically, what we're doing with a regression model is to find other data that are correlated with the rate of victims in a particular area. The aim is to be able to say that there tends to be more victims in certain places with certain other characteristics. These other characteristics, they may be things that are easier to collect. They could also be a proxy for something that is actually very hard to measure, and there are fewer things harder to measure than illicit activities and crimes, and obviously bond slavery is one of those. So the data we use are all from the ONS or government sources, so they're very reliable. And the three variables that help us are the ones in the top left up there. So by looking at the percentage of the population with no qualifications, the percentages that are foreign-born and white, and the percentages that are foreign-born and from an ethnic minority, just those three things about a police force area, we can get a good quality model that predicts the number of victims in each police force area. Basically, you're predicting about 2/3 of the variation in the number of victims. That's quite a good number for this type of model, given the kind of the complexity and the hidden nature of the issue. Now, what's interesting is where when we look at the overall results, the places we predict to be vulnerable to modern slavery tend to match the areas that are actually vulnerable based on the number of reported victims. This contrast between predicted victims and actual victims is actually quite an interesting one. I'll talk about that in the next slide but one, where the number of predicted victims is actually different to the actual reported. That raises some interesting questions about enforcement in those areas and how the problem kind of manifests itself. So yeah, 2/3 explanatory kind of power, that's pretty good. A lot of room for improvement. There are things that we tried but didn't work. You can see those in the bottom left. So unemployment rate, pay rates, police funding per person, the underlying crime rate, which we tried in a whole variety of different ways, the prevalence of low-skilled job types as defined by the ONS. None of those things had any statistical significance on the rate of victims, which was quite interesting in itself. We wanted to get data on other things that are much more hard to measure. So things like, data on other things that are hard to collect and aggregate at the area that we need them. So things like the proportion of the population employed in agriculture, construction, care work, nail bars would be amazing if that data was available, likewise car washes, very high risk sectors. But the granularity we need geographically just doesn't exist. So what we end up with is a map showing the predicted number of victims based on these three demographic characteristics. The highest risk place based on this information is the West Mids, with the Met in second and Bedfordshire in third. You can see there's a sort of an urban-rural bias. Not always the case. Feels like Norfolk and Cambridgeshire sort of bucks that trend slightly, but that tends to be how it manifests itself. A benefit of this approach means that we can apply the lessons that we've learned at the country level or the police force area level to lower levels of geography. So in this case, we've applied what we've learned to the unitary authorities and the boroughs across the UK. There's about 200 in total, as well as the counties. And we just picked out Greater London for the purpose of today because we're here. And it also has the highest risk boroughs in particular. So just a note, there's a slightly different scale, just because the Met is second overall nationally, and that's particularly high rates. There's a bit of a north-south divide, as you can see. Barking and Dagenham over in the east, that is the highest risk both in London and nationally. Newham and Brent in second and third. The top 7 on the table on the left-hand side make up 7 of the top 10 nationally, along with Leicester, Luton, and Sandwell in the West Midlands as well. So coming back to the national picture, this is a comparison between where we expect to be high risk of modern slavery based on the demographic profile versus where it's actually reporting the victims. This raises some interesting questions. So basically the question we're sort of answering here is which parts of the UK are reporting fewer victims than we would expect based on their demographic profiles, and Leicester is the one that sits at the top. So according to actual NRM data about the number of victims reported, Leicestershire is the 34th, has the 34th highest number of victims, putting it some way towards the bottom. If you take Leicestershire's demographic profile, put it into our model, we expect it to be the 6th most risky. And that is an enormous difference. In real terms, what that means is that we expect there to be about 13 victims per 100,000 of working age population, in contrast to the 3 that are actually reported. So anecdotally, we're aware that Leicestershire may be a bit of a hotspot in the UK for modern slavery, particularly the garment industry there. So this kind of, it's a measurement of underreporting. Now there is almost certainly underreporting everywhere, as you've heard with the contrasting of numbers. But this suggests that for some reason, Leicestershire bucks the trend. There are far fewer victims than we would expect. That raises questions as to why that is. Are people more reluctant to come forward there? Is the problem just less there for some reason? It's a difficult thing to answer without additional information or actually kind of being on the ground in that location. So this is kind of part of the wider work that Maplecroft does. We tend to be more globally focused, so 198 countries that we tend to cover. But this type of subnational analysis is really powerful and I think really interesting. We'll kind of update this as more data become available through the NRM and also through additional ONS data sources. Thank you for listening.